Hello and welcome to the fourth and final week of modern JavaScript. So in the last couple of weeks we've taken a look at the JavaScript language, how to interact with the DOM, how to set up event handlers and all that fun stuff, and then last week we played a little bit with jQuery, just showing the different jQuery methods that make working with DOM manipulation a whole lot easier. So in this week what I want to do is I just want to put together just a bunch of individual JavaScript components, stuff that you will find yourself writing a lot if you're working with JavaScript. Now, the thing about JavaScript is that you use it to tie together a bunch of stuff and create interactions with the user on a page. So it's very difficult to sort of, teach what you would be doing all the time, because what you're going to be doing is always going to be specific to what goal you're trying to accomplish. So today I want to put everything that we've learned together and create some reusable JavaScript components that will, like I said, do the same sort of stuff that you might find yourself doing quite frequently if you become a web developer or already are. No, we are not doing WebGL. All right. So the first thing, let's go ahead and just start off with something really simple. The most common thing that you might want to do in JavaScript is a basic drop-down menu. So I know that sounds really basic, and it is really basic, but again, it does bring together a lot of the stuff that we've been playing with, and it's a really good thing to practice JavaScript with, because you should be able to create drop-down menus. That's a fairly standard thing that you might find yourself doing. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to open up my example project. What I have going on here is I have my example HTML, my jQuery 1.10.1, my scripts.js, and my styles.css. And as far as their contents, styles and scripts are both blank, save for our little jQuery function right there. And our example.html is a basic HTML5 document that pulls down jQuery 1.10.1 and scripts.js at the bottom of our body. All right. So drop-downs. Let's talk about, well, we already saw examples of how we can implement drop-downs with CSS in a previous lesson in our HTML and CSS class. So why might you want to implement them using JavaScript? The most common use case these days is for mobile browsers. See, the way that you implement a drop-down using pure CSS is taking advantage of the hover pseudo selector, but with touch devices, you don't really have a hover pseudo selector, or it doesn't work consistently across the different platforms. Now, iOS does usually, mostly, kind of, sort of, sometimes work. In all my testing, iOS seems to be the most consistent as far as working with the hover state with touch, but the other browsers just aren't as good in regards to handling the hover state. So I want to take a look at implementing a basic drop-down menu that will work with touch devices. In addition, there are other situations where you might want drop-downs, particularly for smaller buttons that may be in your navigation bar, such as maybe a notification list that you would see in something like Facebook. Because that button is so small, you wouldn't want to force the user to have to hover over it to gain access to their notifications. Instead, you'd want them to be able to click and have a menu appear. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to implement, just like all the components we're going to be playing around with today, I'm going to implement it in a very flexible manner that takes advantage of, well, the flexible nature of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So it's going to be very clean, very straightforward, and not specific to a particular use case. Okay, so let's start off with our markup. I'm just going to dump down a basic nav element and toss in a UL, and then toss in a couple LIs. And there we have our menu 1 and our menu 2. And if I went over and looked at how this rendered, we would get a very basic unordered list. Now let's jump back into the CSS real quickly just to get these two be left aligned on our page. So to do that, I'm going to add a class to my nav element called primary, And I'm going to jump into my style CSS. I'm going to style nav.primary UL, give it a list style of none. Again, pretty standard stuff. A margin of 0, a padding of 0, and that should be good. Then I'm going to jump down into nav primary UL li, give them all a float left, a padding of 0, and a margin of 0. Then I'm going to jump into my A tags, which I'm going to give them a display block, a float left, a padding of 10 pixels, maybe a background of light gray, and a margin right of 10 pixels. Something like that. Doesn't really matter what they are. And then maybe just because we're super fancy, I'll go ahead and add a hover state for my A tags, giving them maybe a slightly light or darker background. And to top everything off, I'm going to give a text decoration of none and a color black. So this menu isn't going to win any awards, but that is actually really bugging me. For menus, by the way, it's usually better that you have your vertical padding a little bit smaller than your horizontal padding. That's typically a little bit more pleasing. And of course, I applied that change to my margin right as opposed to my padding. And that's what I get for talking and typing at the same time. Okay, so that looks cool. Now what I want to be able to do is I want to be able to click on menu 1 or menu 2 and have a drop-down menu exposed or displayed to the user. So to do that, let's go ahead and talk about what our markup is going to look like. Now I said before that I really want this to be flexible. I don't want to have my menu be coupled or my code that handles my menu to be coupled with this particular use of my menu. I want to be able to use it, well, pretty much anywhere. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a very basic technique that allows me to specify what menu I want to show or hide when a particular A tag is clicked on. And then I'm going to express that element somewhere else and have the contents of my dropdown be present within my markup itself. So there's a variety of ways we can do this as well. From a positioning standpoint and from a relatively clean coding practice standpoint, I'm going to place the contents of the drop-down menu inside of my li tags. Now, depending on the implementation of our drop-down code, we could have placed this element anywhere, but again, it's really good to have your stuff fairly localized to your markup that makes something happen. And I know what I said was, yeah, well, let's go ahead and see what this is going to look like. All right, so I'm going to create a div inside of here, and I'm going to give it a class of dropdown. And then I'm also going to give it an ID of menu-1. Inside of my menu-1, I'm going to put in a UL, li, href, blah, 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 simple drop-downy type stuff. You can put whatever you want in here, obviously. And then I'll put in menu 1.1 and menu 1.2. Now, this does introduce a little problem. The way that I'm writing this markup is that because my menu appears within my UL that appears within my nav primary, I'm going to want to make my selectors a little bit more specific. So to do that, I'm going to add in an immediate descendant relationship between my different selectors so that I don't accidentally style something that I don't want to style. Again, fairly standard stuff if you guys followed along with the HTML and CSS class. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and create another menu, and I'm going to call it menu 2 with class of dropdown, menu 2.1 and 2.2. Then I'm going to come back to my document, refresh, and this is what we get. Now, this isn't quite ideal. The first big problem with our dropdown menus is that they are currently being displayed on our page before we actually click on an element. Since that isn't really what we want our drop-downs to do, we're going to be fixing that in a moment. The second issue is that I want my drop-downs to have a nice little background, maybe a box shadow or something fun like that. So let's go ahead and, before I hide away my drop-downs, I want to go ahead and style them. Then I'll add the code that hides them by default, and then I'll add the JavaScript that will conditionally show them depending on where I'm clicking. So to do that, I'm going to jump back into my styles, and I'm going to style the drop-down class. And what we're going to give the drop-down class is a simple background of, let's invert it. So I'm going to go a dark gray, give it a color of a really light gray, give it a box shadow of 0 pixels, 0 pixels, let's say 4 pixels, RGBA black, 0.6, maybe a border radius of 5 pixels and a border of 2 pixels solid white. Something like that. That might look neat. Yeah, that looks all right. Now, the problem, though, with our drop-downs is that our buttons inside of our menu items inside of our drop-downs are not styled either. So let's fix that. I'm going to go ahead and say drop-down UL, standard stuff, margin padding 0, list style none. Then I'm going to style my LI tags, give them both a margin and padding of 0. Then I'm going to style my A tags, give them a display, a block, a color of white, and a padding of 5 pixels, 10 pixels, something like that. And then just to be, because we're super fancy, let's toss in a hover state. And when we're hovered over it, let's give it a background of even darker gray. Okay, so that looks good. The one thing that we are, of course, missing, or that I forgot to do, was remove the text declaration from our A tags. Okay, so there's the basic markup for our drop-downs, but again, at this particular point, they are shown before you click on the individual menu items, and that is not how we want things to work. So to do that, to fix that, I'm going to go back up to my drop-down selector, and I'm going to give it a display of none. What that's going to do is that's going to hide our drop-downs until we make them visible by clicking on our A tags. So now that I've done that, let's go ahead and write JavaScript in a very clean manner that will allow us to show and hide elements with our being able to click on these A tags. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to give our A tags a data dash, let's do drop down of pound menu 1. So what's going on here? Well, what I'm doing is I'm attaching a data attribute to my element. And again, the data attribute in HTML5, any attribute that's prefixed with data dash is just arbitrary metadata that's associated with that element. And what's cool about that is we can use jQuery to select every single A tag that has the drop-down attribute, or the data drop-down attribute applied to it. And then what I'm doing is inside of my attribute, I'm specifying exactly what element I want to show or hide when this button is clicked on. So let's go ahead and repeat that with our other menu item. I'll do data dash dropdown equals menu 2. And if you guys recall, that symbol right there specifies that this is an ID selector. So I'm selecting the element called menu 2, or the element that has the ID of menu dash 2. So let's go ahead and write some jQuery code, or some JavaScript code. Wow, I should slap myself. Let's go ahead and write some JavaScript code that will go ahead and select out every single A element that has a data dash dropdown attribute. And then let's give them behavior that allows them to show and hide our dropdowns. So jumping back into my scripts.js, now remember, I'm inside of my the callback that's invoked with the jQuery function. Any code inside of this callback will be invoked once the DOM is ready to be manipulated. But most importantly, because we're in a closure, we get a new scope so that our local variables don't conflict with other local variables. So let's go ahead and first get a list, an array of every single A element that has a data dropdown attribute. So I'm going to go ahead and say var dropdown buttons equals jQuery, and then I'm going to say A data dash dropdown. And then for testing purposes, I'm going to go ahead and say console log drop-down buttons. And I'm going to jump back into my markup here. So there are some things or some people that are slightly concerned about how long it takes to actually get into the JavaScript part itself. Well, that again is the nature of JavaScript. JavaScript just exists to script our DOM, our document object model. And in order to present our DOM, we need HTML, like what we have right here. And in order to lay out our DOM, we need CSS right here. Again, that's the specific reason why I organized the JavaScript class to happen after. Oh, come on. Just a sec. My virtual machine is hiding my Chrome window. Of course you are. Let me get my Chrome window back. I'm going to move it off screen, and then I'm going to go back into full screen here. Okay, so again, we need our HTML, our CSS, and our JavaScript. If I go ahead and refresh this page, look what we have. We have an array of 2 A tags. Now, that's because, again, this selector right here will query for every single A element that has the data drop-down attribute on it. So now that we've done that, I'm going to change up this code just a tad. Instead of aliasing out into a variable, which I did for testing purposes to make sure the query was working right, I'm going to instead invoke the each function on each one of these elements. Now, if you guys recall, the each function will loop through every single element inside of a particular array. And again, I can prove that by doing console log this. And if I jump back into Chrome, we get 2 A tags. Okay, so what I need to do now is I need to attach an event handler onto each one of these A tags when they're clicked so that I can show or hide their dropdown. Now, the first thing that I'm going to do, though, is I need to be able to access what value the data dropdown attribute was applied to, because I need to know which DOM element I'm showing or hiding when this button is clicked. So to do that, that's going to require 2 steps. The first step is I need to wrap my this in jQuery so that I gain access to jQuery's functionality on this element. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to say var target element equals this.data dropdown. And then again, just to do some testing so people can know, what steps we're actually performing, I'll go ahead and console log out the target element. And we see that we get 2 logs out, and we get 2 entries because we have an each function being applied to an array with 2 elements inside of it, and we're extracting out the target element attribute. Okay, so now that we have our target element, I'm going to go ahead and say var target element with the jQuery or the money symbol right there equals target element. So what am I doing here? Well, I am retrieving the actual DOM element that is the result of querying our attribute. So again, I'm querying this attribute and I'm retrieving it and stuffing it into a variable called target element that I'll reuse later down the road. So now that I've done that, I need to attach a click handler to each one of these buttons. So I'm going to say this.click function e. Then I'm going to say e.prevent default. Because these link tags actually don't go, or these anchor tags don't actually navigate to anywhere, I just am using them to attach a click handler to. I don't want the browser trying to navigate to that URL fragment. So now that I've done that, what I want to do is I want to say target element.add class open. Now you might be wondering, well, why couldn't I have just done target element.css display block? Now that technically would do the same thing after I add the open class to my style sheet, of course, but I would be very wary of ever invoking the CSS function within JavaScript. Now, obviously, you find yourself doing that quite frequently, but if you can get away with using just pure CSS classes instead, your code will be a lot simpler and more understandable. So what I'm doing is I'm adding the open class to my target element. So now I actually have to go back into my style sheet and tell CSS what it means to be open. So I'm going to say dropdown.open, and I'm going to say display block. Now, this selector will select out any element that has both the classes dropdown and open. And because of the CSS weighting rules, any attribute or property inside of this selector will supersede any property in this selector. We know that because this selector has more weight. We know it has more weight because it's more complex. So now that I've done that, we can jump back, hit refresh, and click on menu 1, and hey, look at that, our drop-down element appears. So that's cool. But we're missing a couple things. First of all, generally when you implement drop-downs, you want to be able to dismiss them by clicking anywhere else on the page. You also want to be able to dismiss them by clicking on either another drop-down or by re-clicking on that element's menu item. So let's go ahead and do that. What I need to do is I need to store the current drop-down that is being displayed to the user. So I'm going to write a var open drop-down, and I'm going to set it to a special value called null. The value of null simply specifies that this variable doesn't point to anything right now. It's just a variable that I can use because it has a name associated with it. So now what I can do is I can add some behavior inside of my click handler, and I can say if open dropdown does not equal null, then open dropdown dot remove class open. Then at the end of this function, I'm going to say open dropdown equals target element. So what that's going to do is now when I go back into my page, I can click on menu 1 and have my menu 1 dropdown appear. Then I can click on menu 2 and have that dropdown appear. Now, the next thing I want to do is if I click on a menu item that is currently being displayed, I want the current dropdown to disappear. So to do that, I'm going to add a little bit more logic into my click handler. I'm going to say if open dropdown equals my target element, then open dropdown remove class open dropdown equals null, and return. Alternatively, in case the return keyword can become a little bit confusing when working with JavaScript for the first time, simply because of the way that our closures are always nested. Like right now, we're actually in 3 functions. We're in a function that was passed into click, we're in another function that was passed into each, and then we're in a third function that was passed into jQuery itself. So instead of using return, I'll use a little bit simpler syntax where I'm going to say if our open dropdown equals our target element, then do that. Otherwise, perform this logic. So now if I come back here and refresh, I can now toggle my open dropdown by clicking on my elements. The final thing I want to do is if the user clicks anywhere on the page, I want to go ahead and dismiss any open dropdown. So to do that, I'm going to add a click handler to my document. So I'm going to say jQuery document.click function. And then I'm going to say if open dropdown does not equal null, then open dropdown.remove class open, and open dropdown equals null. Now this will hopefully this will cause a problem. Yep. Now my menu is broken. Can anybody guess why my menu is now broken? Right. The problem is that what we have going on here is something that is going to happen very frequently while you work with JavaScript. Let's throw some console logs out and see what's going on. Inside of my document click, I'm going to say console log document.click. Inside of my a tags click, I'm going to say console log a.click. When I go back into my page, watch what happens. When I click on menu 1, I get a.click and then I get document.click. The reason I get that is the way that propagation of events work in JavaScript with our DOM. See, when I click on this a tag right here, what happens is this a tag gets clicked on, then the li has a click event handler fired, then the ul has a click event handler fired, then nav, and then body, and then HTML. Which means that when I click on menu 1, it shows the drop-down for a split second until that click event bubbles all the way back to document, and then the document immediately removes my open class from my open drop-down. So this is behavior that's very important to understand. Events, most events, not all, but most events bubble up through the DOM. To fix this, it's actually pretty straightforward. The event object that's passed into our click handlers has a lot of functionality on it that we can use to modify the behavior of the event. One of them we've already seen, prevent default, which, remember, prevent default prevents the browser's default behavior of invoking this click handler. But there's another one, and the other one is called e.stop-propagation. Sorry, I'm enunciating it like that because propagation. There we go. Stop propagation. Yay for not having IntelliSense with Sublime. So by invoking e.prevent propagation, what happens is that event bubbling no longer occurs. And I can prove that by going back here and clicking on menu 1, and we get an error because I misspelled propagation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go off screen, copy and paste the real actual... Wow, I typed in event propagation? Really, guys? See, again, that's what I get for talking and typing at the same time. Okay, so now that we have stop propagation correctly spelled, now when I click on menu 1, notice that a.click gets fired, but document.click does not. But if I were to click anywhere other than these a tags, document.click does get invoked. Okay, so how's everyone feeling so far? All right, so we have a couple problems already with our code. As far as the JavaScript is pretty much as finished as it really needs to be, but there's obviously an issue with the way that our drop-down is being presented to the user. Namely, if I come back here to my example HTML, and if I toss in some lorem, we will see that, well, first of all, our menu is being floated to the left because our UL, blah, blah, blah. But we'll also see that our dropdown is actually competing against the current content in the page. It's not being removed from the flow of the document, which is not going to be ideal. So there's a couple ways to handle this. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to use a basic clearing technique on my UL, or on my nav. I'm going to say div class equals clear. Then I'm going to jump back into my style sheet. Again, this was covered in week 4 of the HTML and CSS class. That'll fix our first problem. So now our menu appears above our content, but when I click on our dropdown does not go above it. Now that's usually not going to be ideal for what we want to do. So to do that, we can fortunately implement most of this just in terms of CSS. Now, I certainly could go into JavaScript itself and figure out the positioning manually. And that is what some people do. It really depends on the circumstance. But in this case, I really want to showcase the power of CSS and get that implemented the way that we should have it implemented by giving our drop-down elements a position of absolute, giving our nav primary ULLIs a position of relative, then going back down to our drop-down, giving it a top of, I don't know, 15 pixels and a left of 0 pixels or something like that. And let's just in case, although it won't make a difference here, I'm going to give it a z-index of 1000. So now I jump back here, and I could, let's go ahead and give our drop-downs a fixed width. So I'm going to give them a width of 150 pixels, and then I'm going to drop them down to 25 pixels. Maybe a little bit more than that. If I open up my Chrome Developer Tools, I can very easily eyeball what I want this to be by going down to my top property and positioning it about where I want it. So I guess 30 pixels should be good. So now if I jump back, we now have a working drop-down menu that can be applied to any elements, or it could be applied to any particular button that shows and opens a particular other element. The last thing that I want to do with this example is I want to add a class to the button that is currently being clicked on. So, and by doing that, I can style my button so it's a little bit more obvious which element is being clicked on at any given time. So to do that, I'm going to jump back into scripts.js and think about what we're going to have to do. So the first thing is we have our open drop-down element, and that is used on both our document click and our item click. So we have to write some logic for opening or closing a drop-down, which not only will it remove the class of open, but it'll also remove a class from the A tag that was responsible for making that drop-down appear in the first place. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to write out this code, then I'm going to refactor it slightly to be a little bit cleaner, and we'll see why that'll be necessary in a moment. So the first thing that needs to be done is that when I click on one of my A tags, so in my click handler right here on line 19, I'm going to have to add a class to the A tag itself. So to do that, I can go ahead and say this.add class open. Or how about active? I like active more than open. That makes more sense. That's also the the terminology that Bootstrap uses. So if you guys recall, this variable is pointing to whatever data dropdown or a element with the data dropdown that's attached to it. Although this variable is not declared inside of this scope. Remember, this scope starts on line 19 and ends on line 35. It is being made available to us because it's located within a parent scope that's located immediately within a function. Which again, I don't necessarily that doesn't necessarily have to make sense quite yet. I just like repeating that sort of terminology over and over again, so hopefully somebody might start to understand the way closures work in JavaScript. Fortunately, you can't really get very far in JavaScript without an understanding of closures and scoping. So now we have a active class being attached to our data dropdowns whenever they're opened. But now we have to remove that class whenever they're closed, which introduces a problem. And the problem is we need to keep track of which current button was responsible for making the current dropdown appear. Now, we can use the basic jQuery data API in order to accomplish that. What I mean by that is when a open dropdown is set, so in this case it's set to target element, I'm going to go ahead and say target element dot data dot button equals this. So what I'm doing is I'm attaching additional data. I'm attaching an object to my open dropdown. Now this code may be a little bit counterintuitive because of the way I'm using references. As you see, I'm modifying target element and then I'm setting open dropdown to target element. To make this code a little bit cleaner, what I could do is I could make the setting of open dropdown happen right there, and then I can interact with open dropdown directly after I set it to the target element. Okay, so now that I've attached the current button that was responsible for making this dropdown appear, I can retrieve that data and remove the active class whenever that dropdown gets removed. Now, unfortunately, there are 3 instances where that might happen, which is why I was talking about earlier how we might want to change up this code just a tad. But let's go ahead and implement it brute force for now. I'm going to start off with the document.click. So when our open dropdown becomes closed on document.click, I need to do open dropdown dot data dot button dot remove class active. So what I'm doing is I'm retrieving the button data element out of my open dropdown that was set on line 36. So this invocation of data sets the current button that was responsible for making this dropdown appear to the button data element. And then this code on line 10 is responsible for retrieving that element and then modifying it by removing its class. Now we have to do this 2 more times. So I'm going to take this code, copy it, and I'm going to paste it right here, which this is when you close a dropdown by re-clicking on the same button. I want to remove its active class. This code is actually functionally similar to if I just used the this variable, because in this case this equals that. I love programming terminology. Anyway, hopefully you get what I'm saying. The final place where we have to remove the active class from our button is if we are replacing an open dropdown. Okay, so by making all those JavaScript modifications, I can jump back into my code and see it in action. If I go ahead and inspect my A tag right here, we'll see it down here, right here, my A data dropdown menu 1, blah, 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 and click on it. Notice how it gets a class of active. Then when I click off of it, the class disappears. And I can also see that behavior with menu 2. See how I'm swapping the active class between the two? And then when I click off, the active class disappears. So because I've done that, I can jump back into my styles and style the A tag if it has the active class. What I'm going to do is I'm going to set a background to dark gray, a color of white or something, it doesn't really matter, and a cursor of default. That's pretty standard for that sort of thing. Now, we have one more issue with our thing right here. The issue is that our hover state is resetting the color because the hover state actually has a higher precedence than the active class selector. So we're setting the background color is what we're doing, sorry. So as you see, when I hover over that, those elements get, or those styles get applied. The way I like to handle this sort of situation is there's a variety of ways we could handle it, but the way I typically handle it is I create another selector with a hover state. So all I did was copy and paste this selector and then add the hover state right here. That'll give this selector a higher precedence than this selector. An alternative that we discussed in the CSS and HTML class is to use the important flag, but I try to avoid the important flag as much as possible. So now that we've done that, I can come back here, and when I click on them, we see that the hover state no longer affects them. I guess as the final thing, let's go ahead and do something fun real fast. You'll notice this as a pattern with me, because CSS can be really fun. What I want to do is I'm going to add a transition all 500 milliseconds ease out. And then I can go ahead and do the same with my drop-downs. On my drop-down, I'm going to give it a display block and an opacity of 0. And then on drop-down open, I'm going to give it an opacity of 1. And then I'm going to give it a transition all 500 milliseconds ease out. So now we get a nice little, that's not going to work because the display none is getting animated as well. So I want to transition just on the opacity property. Did I not spell transition correctly? Whatever. But yeah, so now we have a cool little thing. I'm not quite getting a very good animation on my end because of the recording software I have going on right now. But the point is that it is animated. It does look kind of cool, even if it's a little slow. Okay, so how's everyone feeling about our drop-downs? Again, this is a very common thing that you'll find yourself doing in JavaScript, particularly for like notification type stuff. It's also useful when working with mobile designs, simply because mobile browsers don't really like hover states very much. Right. The two cases, just to reiterate, the two cases that I would use this over a CSS implementation is, again, for if you're having difficulty with your mobile layout not working correctly with mobile browsers, or you have a button that's relatively small. For example, I could show an example of that right here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create an li class notifications. And inside of this li, I'm going to place an a tag. So this is going to be similar to how Facebook implements its notifications. Give it a 5 or something, and then have a div id notification menu class drop down with a ul li a href blah notif1. How many did I say? 5, 2, 3, 4, 5. So then what I can do, oops, that's not how you spell notifications. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump back into my styles. I'm going to style my notifications element to float right, which actually that's not how Facebook does it. Facebook does it to the left, but 3D Buzz does it to the right. Then I'm going to style my A tag within my notifications to be text align of center and a width of 64, something funny like that. Jump down here, refresh, and now I have my notification menu, which of course doesn't work because I didn't attach the data attribute to it. So it's data dropdown equals notification menu. Jump back into this, click on this, and we have our notifications. Now in this case, it's not going to look quite right, simply because my button is floated to the right. So what I want to do instead is I want my drop-down menu to be right aligned instead of left aligned. But that's super easy to do too. I can jump back into my styles and style my drop-down with a left of 0, or sorry, a left of auto and a right of 0. And now I have Facebook style notifications with a really, really ugly button. I'm not sure 64 width was the right choice in that case. So again, now we have a fancy little Facebook style notification button, which would not be appropriate to do with pure CSS. The reason this would not be appropriate to do with pure CSS is that CSS only works with hovering, and that just wouldn't work right because this button is so small. I could see users become very frustrated with getting the drop-down to appear. So it's much nicer to have a click drop-down. Okay, so just like I promised, let's jump back into the scripts.js. I'm not liking how we repeat this code over and over and over and over again. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to write a function called close current dropdown. I'm going to basically cut all the code right here, paste it into the close current dropdown function, and then replace this with an invocation of close current dropdown. Then I'll do the same thing right here, and I'll do the same thing right here. All right, so it's funny that, oh great, hold on, my VM ate my Chrome window. Here we go. So what's funny about this is that there isn't a whole lot of JavaScript, but this is an example of using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript together in a really clean way. Just to reiterate, we use HTML for our page structure. So we give our page structure, we give our page content using HTML. And we also take advantage of things like the data attributes in order to specify functionality. Now we don't define functionality, we're just using HTML to specify it, saying that this button will result in this menu 1 being turned into a dropdown. We're specifying that behavior with HTML, which is really the most appropriate place to put that sort of information. The alternative would be having JavaScript having to specify this data, which that isn't very ideal because then our functionality gets split into two locations, one in the JavaScript and one in the HTML, which isn't the best use of separation of concerns. So then we use JavaScript to modify our DOM. And really all it's doing is it's just adding and removing classes. So we add classes and we remove classes. And generally speaking, that's mostly what you do with JavaScript. Because CSS is such a powerful language to express layout that by making clever use of CSS inside of JavaScript allows us to have very clean, short JavaScript while having all of our actual layout code be expressed in CSS. So the last thing I'll do is I'll knock out these two little console logs just so people can appreciate how short this script actually is, and yet how much functionality it gives us on this page. All right, so how's everyone feeling? Alrighty. Okay, so I think this would be a good opportunity to take a short break. So I'm going to go ahead and pause the video. Okay, so we're back. A question did come in over the break that I thought was interesting. The question is, do I think that CSS is trying to replace as much of JavaScript as it can? The answer to that question is very complex because CSS isn't trying to replace anything. CSS is just becoming powerful enough these days that it can express what CSS is meant to express. See, in the past, CSS wasn't very powerful. It's become a lot more powerful in recent years, and as a result of that, you needed a lot of JavaScript code to make CSS more palatable or to do things that weren't possible with CSS in the past. But since the introduction of a lot of CSS functionality and with the with browser compatibility becoming easier and easier to deal with, CSS now finally is taking the role that it was always supposed to have had in the first place, without the need of having a JavaScript shim in between. So again, we see an example of a blank screen. There we go. We see an example of us using JavaScript to control all this is doing is it's controlling CSS classes, and the CSS itself is what's taking care of the layout of the page, which is exactly what CSS is built for. And then our HTML is taking, with the introduction of the data attributes and stuff like that with HTML5, it's allowing us to express things in HTML that always should have been expressed in HTML, but weren't able to be expressed in HTML in previous versions. So that's one of the most important things about this class. This is about modern JavaScript, how we can combine a working knowledge of CSS and HTML, glue it together with JavaScript to represent some, relatively complex interactions with the user with very minimal code. And the benefit to this implementation is the flexibility. Not only do I have the flexibility in my style sheets to change the presentation of any of these individual elements, I also have the flexibility in my HTML to create new drop-downs without even touching JavaScript. All I gotta do is add a data drop-down attribute. The rest is taken care of by JavaScript. Alright, so what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to create another JavaScript file, and I'm going to call it drop-downs. The reason I'm doing this is I want to dump all of this code into my dropdowns.js file, just so that while we work with some other components, this code doesn't conflict with the other code that we're about to write. So I just want to make things a little bit easier for everyone to look at so we can focus on one thing at a time. Now that I've moved all of my drop-down code into my dropdowns.js file, I have to go back to my markup and add in a reference to my dropdowns.js. Okay, so now that I've moved all that code out of my main scripts file, we can take a look at some really simple components. I just want to back up and show you guys that JavaScript doesn't need to be as terrifying as this. We can implement some cool stuff with some very minimal amounts of code. One of them is very common, and that is an autofocus. So, for example, we may have like a login form, and a login form may have an input type text, placeholder, username, and then an input type password, and then maybe an input type submit with the value of login. So now if I jump back into here, what we'll see is we'll have our username, our password, and our login button. That's really bugging me. Give me one sec. I'm going to add a class called login form to my form. Jump into my style sheets. This isn't necessary for anybody else to do. It's just the margins are irritating me a little bit. I'm going to toss in a margin top of 20 pixels. Alright, so what you might want to do is whenever a user enters your page, you might want to autofocus a form element. Now, we certainly could write code in our JavaScript that looks like this. I could say, well, first I have to give my input a name. The reason I have to give my input a name is I need to be able to select it. So I'm going to say name equals username. Now in my scripts, what I could do is I could say input with the name of username dot focus. Jump back here, hit refresh, and now whenever I refresh this page, my username is automatically focused. So, that's neat to see that done with one line of JavaScript. And again, all this JavaScript code is doing is it's waiting for the page to be ready. Again, the reason it's doing that is because we have a function passed into our jQuery object. Then it's selecting an input with the name attribute equal to username, and it's invoking the jQuery focus method on it to cause it to gain focus. So you think that's as good as you can get. It is jQuery, not exactly JavaScript. I'm not entirely sure if there is a focus function on naked HTML elements. I know that there is a way to focus naked HTML elements, but I'm not sure of the browser idiosyncrasies involved. What I do know is that there is a jQuery method called focus that does that for us. Yes, I do know that onFocus is native. All I'm saying though is when I say that this is a jQuery method, I know it's a jQuery method because I'm acting on a jQuery object, whether or not there's a method called focus on the underlying HTML element is irrelevant to the way I'll express this code in the English language. Because again, we are working with jQuery. We know we're working with jQuery because we have a jQuery element that we're invoking a method on. So this might look cool. You might do something like this quite a bit for different pages, but you might start to find that it becomes a little bit annoying to have to do this for every single element that you might want to autofocus throughout your entire application. So instead, in the name of, well, making our code a little bit more succinct and a little bit more awesome, what we can do is remove the explicit dependency on our JavaScript knowing about our particular element called username, and instead use the data attribute. So what do I mean by that? Well, if I jump back to example.html, I want this form element to be autofocused. And I want to do it without modifying my JavaScript at all. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say data-autofocus. Now, this isn't going to actually do anything, like at all, by just adding the data autofocus attribute. That is a custom attribute that I am adding to this element. But I can go back into my JavaScript, and instead of having instead of coupling my JavaScript to my particular form element, I can say input with the data autofocus attribute focus. So now we see the exact same behavior. Now what's the difference? The difference is that this script will now work on anything that I want to autofocus. What if I don't want the username to be autofocused? What if instead I want the password to be autofocused? All I got to do is take this data-autofocus attribute, dump it on my password, come back here and refresh. And now our other element is being autofocused without having to modify our JavaScript at all. So I hope you guys are starting to see that these data attributes allow us to express declaratively within HTML what we want to have happen, and then we use JavaScript to actually do that thing. So does autofocusing make sense to everyone? I don't even need this name anymore. The only reason I had that name in there was to be able to show you guys a simpler example. The name isn't relevant now that I have the data autofocus attribute. So, is everyone good with that? Hopefully, maybe, quite possibly, or not? Okay, well, someone thinks it's cool. It's good enough for me. Let's move on to something simpler, or not simpler, a little bit more complex, but still pretty straightforward. It's very common to have a question did come in, couldn't you have done this? The answer is going to be no, and I'll tell you why. What's going on here? Well, actually, hopefully we should be getting an error. We do get an error. We get an error that says object has no method focus. Specifically, it's actually saying object blank has no method focus. Now, that's significant because what's going on here is that we are, okay, so let's read this code out loud. Let's break it down and see exactly what's going on, because method chaining in jQuery can get confusing sometimes. So let's break it down by aliasing these out into variables. So I'm going to say all inputs equals input. All inputs, this variable is going to contain an array of every single input on the page. That's because this selector, the CSS selector right here, is selecting out every single input element. Then what we're doing is we're saying the value of autofocus equals all inputs dot data autofocus. Then what we're saying is value of autofocus dot focus. So let's break down why this isn't going to work. Well, if I take a look at all inputs, so if I do a console log all inputs, what I'm going to get an array of is every single input on the page. We can prove that by looking at our inspector. We get 3 inputs, 1 text, 1 password, and 1 submit, corresponding to the username, password, and button. Then we invoke the data function on it. By invoking the data function on it, what's going to happen? This particular data function is only being invoked with one argument. Now, remember, what that means is that whatever value that this data element has will be returned. It does not return a jQuery object necessarily. It returns whatever value is contained within the data at this key. Now, the way jQuery works with the data function is that this will actually only return the first element inside of my array, and it'll only return that particular element's data value. So if I go back into my page and I refresh, you'll see that what I get is blank. Now, it's hard to see right there because it literally is blank. I can make it a little bit more explicit for you guys by doing something like autofocus equals blah. Whoops, blah. And we can go back into our page and see that autofocus equals blank. Then the next thing that we're doing is we're invoking the focus function on the value of autofocus. The focus function does not exist on what was returned by data, because what was returned by data is, if I use a type of operator, not an HTML element or a jQuery element, what's returned is a string, because it pulled out the value of the data autofocus element, or the value of this attribute, and returned it into the value of autofocus. And because string has no function called focus, then we can't do it that way. So that's why that's not going to work. So all of this code right here that I've selected is equivalent to this one line of code. And it is very handy to be able to break apart a chained function call like this in order to see what's going on. So that's why instead what we have to do is we have to query the document. Okay, so let's go ahead and do something that most of you guys have probably seen quite a bit of already on the web, and those are just little alerts that pop up with little close buttons. So let's talk about that. I'm going to create a div class alert. Some sort of alert, and then I'm going to have an href blank class close, and then I'm going to say x, and then what I get is a little alert. Now, obviously that's not going to display the way I want it to quite yet, but that's what CSS is for. So let's add in a little bit of CSS so you guys see where I'm going with this. I'm going to give my alert class a background of red, a color of white, and an overflow of hidden. Then I'm going to style my closed a.close, and I'm going to give it a float right display block, text decoration none or something like that. Doesn't really matter what I do. I can play with this for hours. That looks awful. Let's give it a color white and a padding of 10. And I just arrow shook everything off my desktop, which is wonderful. I hate arrow shake, by the way. Have I ever mentioned that? Anyway, the point is that this is very common. I'm not going to worry about making this look pretty right now because that's not the point. The point is I hope everybody has at one point seen like an alert come up on a web page with the little close button. And what I want to do is I want to write some JavaScript that makes implementing these alerts very simple without having to write JavaScript for every alert that you might want to display. Also, that red is going to give me a seizure. So I want to be able to click this close button and have this alert go away. So to do that, let's go back and look at our markup. The markup is a div with the class of alert, and then it has an a tag with the class of close. So this is actually going to be very simple to implement in JavaScript. All I got to do is I got to select all my alert elements, and then I want to select their a.close elements, and then when they're clicked on, I want to add an event handler that prevents default, because I don't want to navigate to where the A tag is pointing to with the href attribute. Then I'm going to say jQuery this dot parents dot alert dot remove. Now if I come back into my page, by clicking that X, the alert disappears. I could make this a little bit more fancy by throwing in some jQuery animations or whatever, but that's not the point. The point is that this is a very simple example of adding in a very basic component to our web project that we can use however many times we want. For example, let's say this is an alert, but this is specifically an error alert. Let's say we have another alert called warning, and then we go into CSS, and I'm going to say alert.error has a border of 2 pixels solid red. Maybe we give all of our alerts a border radius of 5 pixels and a margin of 5 pixels, 0 pixels. And then our alert.warning has a border of 2 pixels solid yellow or orange, whichever one you prefer for warnings. So now we have 2 alerts, and when we click on them, it removes them. So let's go ahead and break down the code, because as small as it is and as simple as what I just showed you guys it shows a lot of really cool things that we can do with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Let's start off with the HTML, move on to the CSS, and then do the JavaScript. So what we have going on here is we have our alert class, and then we specialize our alert elements with an additional class. The ability to have multiple classes attached to an element is very powerful in HTML and CSS, and JavaScript actually. Then, inside of each one of our alerts, we specify one of our A tags as being the close button. We do that by giving it a class called close. So, inside of our CSS, we're able to create our alerts, style them however we want. Then we're also able to give each one of our specialized alert classes their own styles. And we give our close tag its own style. So for anybody who's followed along with HTML and CSS class, this should be pretty straightforward. The fun stuff comes into play with JavaScript. Again, there's a lot going on in such a small piece of code, so I don't want anybody to take this stuff for granted. The first thing that we do is we query for every a.close element that appears within an alert element. Then, once we've performed that query, we attach a click handler to every single element that matches this. And the click handler is expressed with the closure that we pass in. The closure starts with the keyword function on line 5 and ends with the ending curly brace on line 8. First thing we do is we prevent the default behavior, because remember, these are A tags, which means if we click on them, we're going to navigate to that href. Well, we don't want to navigate to that empty fragment. Then we do something really cool. Now, if you guys remember, again, I've said this many, many times before, but I want to drill it into everybody's heads. When we enter in an event handler, the this object points to the HTML element that we're looking at, which means to give it jQuery's behavior or jQuery's functionality, we have to wrap it in an invocation of jQuery to basically make a special object that has all of jQuery's behavior attached to it. We then invoke the jQuery function called parents. Now, parents is a really cool function that will return an array of every single parent element of this particular object we're looking at. In addition, we can further specialize that lookup by providing a selector. That selector will be used to filter out what parent we're wanting to look at. So by doing this.parents.alert on one of my a.closes, I can go into my DOM and show you guys how exactly that's going to resolve. Because if I inspect my a tag, what jQuery is going to do with the parents invocation is it's going to walk up the hierarchy and find a parent that matches the selector I passed in. And the selector I passed in simply specifies that I want to select out anything that has a class of alert. The final thing that I want to go ahead and do is remove it from the DOM entirely by just invoking remove. So that just deletes it, basically. We can take a look at that behavior by looking at our DOM right here in our inspector, clicking on this X and seeing that that element disappears entirely. So there's a lot of really cool things that are being expressed with a very short bit of syntax. And again, it's a combination of our HTML, our CSS, and our JavaScript. So how's everyone doing with alerts? Alrighty. So that was just a really straightforward JavaScript component. We've actually implemented two more JavaScript components, one being the autofocus and one being our alert boxes. And again, we've built up our drop-down menu, of course, as well. So let's go ahead and wrap up with one more component that I want to write for you guys. And it's something else that you will find yourself using quite a bit when writing in JavaScript or creating any sort of web application. And those are going to be tabs. Tabs are a very common thing that we might find in, well, stuff. You know what I'm saying. So what I'm going to do, like I always do, is I'm going to start off with my markup. I want to create a div with a class of tabs. Now there are 1,000,001 different ways that we can write the markup and the implementation for a tabbed component. This way it's just going to be the one that is most straightforward to me, but again, you'll see a lot of different varieties of implementations of tabbed components. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to write a UL tag inside of my tabs, and I'm going to say UL li ahref ali. I'm going to say tab 1, 2, and 3. Now the next thing I'm going to do is each tab button is going to cause another element to appear within my tabs container. So I'm going to go ahead and write a div with an ID of tab 1. And then I'm going to write my tab 2 and my tab 3. And I'm going to place them all within my DOM. Like so. Then, the last thing that I need to do is I need to wire up each one of these buttons to the individual elements that they represent when clicked on. So it's actually going to be very similar to what we did with our drop-downs. So if people were slightly confused about the drop-down code, here's a chance to see another implementation of a similar concept. So I'm going to say data-tab equals tab 1, data tab equals tab 2, and data tab equals tab 3. So there's my markup. All my markup is an element with a class of tabs with a UL that has the navigation for the tabs within it, then my tab 1, tab 2, and tab 3. The last thing that I'm going to do, just because I don't want to bring in a clear fix right now, actually no, I don't have to worry about that because I'm not going to, not going to worry about that. So this is all we need. If we come back into our page, what we'll see is what you'd expect. Our tabs do not look like tabs, and all of our tab pages appear within our, oh great. Okay, so we have our tabs that appear within the flow of our document, which obviously is not desirable. So let's do the next step. What's the next step? Well, the next step is to go ahead and style this. I'm going to jump into my style CSS. Let's say tabs I'm going to go ahead and give it a border of 3 pixels, solid, light gray. Then I'm going to style my tabs UL with the margin 0, padding 0, a list style of none. This would be a whole lot easier with the CSS reset style sheet, but I don't have one on hand. Margin 0, padding 0, float left, display block, padding 5 pixels, 10 pixels, text decoration none. I'll just leave the color as blue for now. And then for the hover, for the hover I'll go ahead and say text decoration underline. Last thing I'm going to do, just to make this look a little bit nicer, is my UL. If you guys recall, my UL is what contains all of my elements. I'm going to go ahead and say overflow hidden, so that it stretches for the entire height of all of my floated elements. And then I'm going to say background there. So that should look a little bit more like tabs. So we have tab 1, tab 2, and tab 3. It's not very pretty, but that's not the point. So the next thing we got to do is I want to, by default, have each one of my tab pages hidden. By default. Now I'll override that with JavaScript, but for now I want them all to be hidden. So what's the easiest way for me to, by default, have each one of these 3 elements, my tab 1, 2, and 3, to have a display of none? Can anybody think of the selector that would do that? Again, I want CSS to be responsible for making all 3 of these pages hidden from the DOM by default. So I want to write a selector that will only select out these 3 elements without being specific to these IDs. Well, that's close. What I want to do is I want to do tabs greater than div and display none. Now this is significant because I don't want every single div that's within my tabs to be hidden. I only want the ones that appear immediately underneath my tabs element. So now if I go back and refresh, notice how my tabs get taken out of the flow of the document. I can see that they still exist. Right down here, they just, well, they're hidden with display none. So that's really cool, but I want to have a selected tab. Furthermore, I want the HTML itself to tell JavaScript which tab to have selected by default when the page loads. So just like what we did with my drop-downs, I'm going to add a class to my specific tab specifying that I want this one to be the active tab. So I'm going to say class equals active. Now that I have that in place, I can go ahead and jump back into my styles and add one more rule. My final rule is just going to be a.active, and I'm going to give it a background of white and a cursor of default. So now if I come back, my tab 1 is selected, but I still don't get my tabs being displayed. And that is the job of JavaScript. So let's go ahead and write the JavaScript that would be responsible for doing this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create another JavaScript file called tabs so that I don't have to be looking at my other JavaScript components while I'm writing this. So again, that's just a matter of right-click, new, text document, tabs.js, load it up in Sublime, and add it down to the bottom as an include. Okay, so let's go ahead and write this. What I need to do is, the first thing I need to do is I need to loop through every single tab element, every single element that has a class of tabs. The reason I'm going to do it this way is that I want to be able to have more than one tab component on my page at once. So I'm not going to be doing what I did with my drop-down, where I contained my open drop-down as a global reference right here. Instead, I'm going to have to be a little bit more careful. so that I can have multiple tab groups on my page at once. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to open up that, which again just makes it so this code will only execute once the page is done loading. In addition, it will provide me with a new scope so I don't get variable conflicts. Then I want to do .tabs.each, and then I want to say var tab equals this. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is I want to add a click handler to every one of my buttons on my tab. I can do that very easily by doing tab.find ula click. So what does this do? Well, this invokes the find function on my currently selected tab element. The find function is used to go deeper within the HTML hierarchy without restarting a query. What do I mean by that? Well, what I just did was I'm going to loop through, on line 3, I'm going to loop through every single div, or any element really, that has the class of tabs. Then, inside of that, I'm going to find each ULA and attach a click handler to it. Now, it's very important that I use the greater than symbol right here, because I only want to find the A tags that are underneath the immediate UL of my tabs element. I don't want to find A tags that might be within my tab content, such as tab 1, tab 2, because that would really mess things up. Okay, so now that I've done this, the first thing I gotta do is I gotta prevent default. Then I need to find the element that represents the current tab. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean I need to notice how we have this data-tab on each one of our A tags. I need to actually execute this query to return the element that I want to be responsible for that tab. So I can go ahead and say var page, tab page equals jQuery. I'll need a this.data.tab. So all this is doing is it's retrieving out my tab attribute, and it's using that to create a jQuery, query that returns the tab element that I'm looking at. Okay, so now that I've done that, every time that I click on an element, what I can do now is I can show or hide that element. And I can also add or remove the active class from my current A tag. So I can say this.add class active and page.add class open. Now, the final thing that I need to do is go back into my CSS and actually add the open class selector or open rule to my tab pages. So as we can see right here, I have 3 tab pages, but all of them are hidden. When I click on one of my tabs, it gets the open class. Now what I got to do in CSS is say if it has the open class, I want to display it. So how do I do that? Well, tabs div.open display block. Alright, so that's actually getting pretty close to what I want, but we're missing 2 things. First thing that we're missing is when I click on another tab, I want the current open tab to be hidden. So, it's pretty straightforward to do. I gotta keep track of my currently open tab. I might get tab and tag confused because in Washington, you have what are called vehicle tabs that you attach to the back of your license plate, but in Tennessee they're called tags. Or did I get that mixed up? Either way, I got in an argument about it a while ago with somebody in Tennessee, and it was really frustrating. Now I get those 2 words confused all the time. Anyway, so what I gotta do is I gotta add a local variable that'll keep track of the current open page. So I'm gonna say var open page equals null. Then what I'm going to do at the end of this is I'm going to say if openPage does not equal null, then openPage.remove class open. And then I also need to change the class for my actual tab buttons up here. So to do that, I actually need to retrieve a reference to that A tag. There's a couple ways we can do that. The easiest way would actually be to, instead of using a click handler, to use an each handler. The reason I didn't show this at first was because we didn't need it until now, and it is a fairly complex reason why we do need it. And it all comes back down to scoping. It also is also needed because I want to, instead of just handling these things when I click on them, I want to loop through each one of my A tags in order to collect data about them. So I'm going to change this code just to tad. Instead of doing .click, I'm going to do .each. Now if you recall, the each function will loop through every single element found in the query. Then, instead of doing E, because there is no E, I'm going to take this code, I'm going to move the this up to the top, and I'm going to say this.click function E, and then everything will just be normal, as it was before. So why did I do that again? Well, I did that so that I can now attach additional data to each one of my A tags while I'm looping forward, as well as grab out my page. So I'm going to take my page and I'm going to move it down here, and I'm going to use the comma operator, and I get this. Now, my page needs to know which button, which tab button it's associated with. So I'm going to say page.data button this. Now, why does the page need to know what button it's associated with? Well, if we come back down here to my click handler, we'll see that we're able to remove the open class from our open page variable, but we're not currently able to remove the active class from the current active button. But now we can, because the open page will now have a data member called button that I can invoke and say remove class active, and then I can finish this all off by saying open page equals page. If I come back down here, we'll see we have tab 1, tab 2, and tab 3, and it actually works. The only problem, though, is that it currently doesn't respect the currently active tab. Remember, back in my HTML, I am using the class equals active to tell my tab widget which tab I want to be active by default. Maybe to make this example a little bit more convincing, I'll go ahead and have the second tab have the active class. So what I need to do is jump back into my JavaScript and detect if one of my elements has a particular class inside of this each function. Remember, this each function is invoked for every single A tag within our navigation. So to do that, I can jump down here and I can say if this has class active, we want to do two things. First thing we need to do is open our page by adding the open class to our page. The second thing we need to do is set the reference to the current open page to our page. Now we don't need to add the active class to ourselves because we already have it. So now if I jump down here, notice how when I refresh, my second tab is automatically open, and I can move between 1, 2, and 3. Maybe to make this example a little bit easier to see, I can change that border to like a dark black, and then add a box shadow, 0 pixels, 0 pixels, 5 pixels, RGBA, 0, 0, 0.5, something like that. We'll make it stand out just a tad more. Actually, a lot more. But still, you get the point. We now have a tab widget. So you know what's really cool about this? It actually allows me to fail miserably. So realize that when I click on an already active tab, it just dies. I can fix that behavior real fast by adding a simple check here. I can say if page does not equal open page, then do this. There we go. That fixes that. Now, the final example that I want to show you guys for my tabs is the way that I wrote it wasn't an accident. The way that I wrote it was specifically so that I can have multiple tab controls on the same page. So I want to go ahead and express that, and I'm going to do that by adding a padding inside of my divs. I'm doing this for display purposes only. It has no relevance to the actual JavaScript. And I'm actually going to add a nested tab control into my document. So I can do that by adding another div class tabs. And all I have to do is I have to follow the exact same markup as what I did with the other tab. So I'll say tab 2.1, 2.2, and then I'll give 2.1 a class of active, and then I'll go ahead and give this a data tab of tab 2.1, give this a data tab of 2.2, create a div with an ID of tab 2.1, H2, or how about H3? That would be a little bit better. Tab 2.1, and then we can do 2.2. So all I did was added a nested tab control. I did not modify my JavaScript whatsoever. And if I jump back, what we have is an example of a nested tab control. So it gives us a whole lot of flexibility. We're able to add tabs wherever we want in our document. And that's all possible because of the way that I wrote the JavaScript. When I say the way I wrote the JavaScript, it's specifically in reference to how I invoke the each function on all of my elements to have the tab control or the tab class. The reason that's significant is because it opens up a new scope, which means each tab control gets its own scope with its own open page variable, which means that each tab knows what its current open page is, and it doesn't interfere with the other tabs. Alright, so how's everyone feeling? So, well, if anybody can come up with questions, that would be great. But in the meantime, I'll go ahead and we did get a question about why we're using IDs. If I go into my markup, you'll see that I have each button needs to know what tab page that it corresponds to. I expose that through an ID. So if I look at my IDs down here, we have an ID of tab 1, an ID of tab 2, an ID of tab 3. Then the data tab attribute, what this does is this gives me a selector that will be used to determine which element is a particular tab. This is in particular, this is a ID selector. We know it's an ID selector because it starts with that pound sign or hash or whatever it is that NATO keeps on correcting me. So the IDs are, again, the IDs are there for no other purpose other than to be able to uniquely select this element. IDs, that is what IDs are for. IDs are for elements that you need to uniquely select, because you can only have one element with one ID on the same page. Now, I could have used a class. I could have said class, and then I would change my data tab attribute to look like that. That would still work, but I would find this a little bit less appropriate. And the reason that is because I don't want to ever have multiple tab pages that are become active when I click on a tab button. That doesn't make any sense. And so as a result, I chose to use IDs instead. Does that make sense? Yeah, I'm just using the IDs to link my A tag with the specific div that's responsible. And the way I do that, if I collapse it, it might become a little bit more apparent. The way that I do that within code is that I invoke this. This will return a query that is this. Well, actually, I can go ahead and make this code a little bit more explicit by saying page selector equals this data tab. And then I could say page selector. Now there are, like I said before, there are many different ways of exposing or of creating tabs. Some of them are more complex than others because some of them would require some more powerful DOM manipulation. In this case, I wanted to do as little DOM manipulation as possible, which is why I separated my header with all the tab buttons from my actual tab content. However, with some, fancy little jQuery trickery, you could certainly make it so that your buttons are generated for you and have your markup be a little bit more semantic. But in this case, this is just the most straightforward implementation I could think of. So just recap, we talked a lot about different ways that we can use JavaScript to create user interface widgets on our web applications. And really, that's a lot of what JavaScript is all about. Obviously, once you get into things like single-page applications and more complex applications that work with data, you start to need to use JavaScript to do things like page routing and URL managing and all that fun stuff. But that's something that is going to become a lot more complex than what we've been dealing with today. Today, we've been focusing mainly on how we can manipulate the DOM to make our pages more semantic and easier to work with, while having the JavaScript be kind of out of the way, and then using style sheets to perform our actual layout and styling. So we looked at creating drop-downs, such as this. Fairly straightforward drop-down implementation. The markup looks, I'm very fine with this markup. It's pretty straightforward. It's very close together. I like it. We talked about autofocusing, where we're able to add a special data attribute and get one of our form elements to autofocus on page load. We see an example of that with the username. We talked about basic alerts, which is a fairly straightforward JavaScript technique that you'll see used a lot, where basically all it's doing is allowing me to have a special close button that makes the alert disappear. And then finally we talked about tabs, and specifically how to write tabs in such a way that we can accomplish nested tabs without having to touch a line of JavaScript. Because now that we've implemented this tabs.js file, which is only 37 lines long, we can create as many tabs as we want without ever touching JavaScript again, which is definitely something that you should kind of strive for when working with web development, because it allows your code to be a lot more modular and reusable. So, if there are any more questions, go ahead and post them right now, or is everyone doing pretty good? Hello? All right, well, it doesn't look like we have any questions, so I guess to all you future people, I will be seeing you later. Once I find, there you are. All right, goodbye.